Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's health and wellness webinar. From guidance to action, what's new in the DGAs, what's challenging, and strategies for promoting produce. We are thrilled to have multiple speakers and panelists here with us today, brought to you by the Foundation for Fresh Produce. For those who don't know me, I'm Katie Calagaro. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here at the Foundation, and it's my pleasure to host you today for our first webinar of 2026. At the Foundation for Fresh Produce, we are growing a healthier world by changing the trajectory of human health. That's the mission. I feel like we all collectively believe this, and we also all collectively believe that fruits and vegetables are the answer. When we're thinking about our goals and how to achieve our mission, we're looking to remove barriers that prevent people from eating more fruits and vegetables. So we're looking at four strategic outcomes: boosting appeal, driving demand, making sure that people are choosing and eating fruits and vegetables every day. We want to improve access, and it's just that making them accessible can make them easier to eat more. Nurturing fruit and vegetable professionals is a goal for us, offering professional development and educational resources for professionals like you. And then scaling partner impact, really bringing people together, forming strategic alliances so that we can strengthen our collective global impact. As a global foundation, thinking globally but acting locally, this work culminates here in the United States with our Have a Plant digital ecosystem. And this helps us all come together with one unified message. You'll see the Have a Plant campaign throughout our materials and at fruitsandveggies.org, as this is the consumer call to action and hub to make it easy and inspires consumers to have a plant every time we eat. We do this by creating compelling content to inspire consumers. We distribute science-based, consumer-focused resources and food and nutrition health community engagement tools to help us engage with you all to reach consumers every day through fruitsandveggies.org, our social media channels, and our newsletters. We're your one-stop shop for all things fruits and veg. We've also upped our game in the For Professionals section, where we continue to add new resources for health and wellness professionals like you. I wanted to highlight some of the unique new resources and insights that are in this section. That includes consumer behavior and nutrition research reports, toolkits with promotional ideas, seasonal recipes, and turnkey social media posts and more. And then also, this is where the continuing education gets saved down for webinars like today, where we unpack new research related to growing consumption of fruits and vegetables, and then we share practical ways to implement it into your respective communities and practices. So before we begin, of course, we have to have a few housekeeping notes. The CPE activity application for this webinar is pending at the moment at CDR, and that will be, once it's approved, approval for one CPEU credit. We will email that out to you once it has been approved. And guess what, everyone? You can sit back, relax, take it all in today, because this webinar will be recorded, and we will send you this link to the presentation and the recording with your certificate for your CPEU credit after the presentation. So what about questions? I'm sure this one's going to be full of activity. Feel free to type in the chat, but also we're going to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen for our Q&A section at the end. If you think of it, put it in while you're thinking of it so you don't lose it. But then we'll come back to it and I will help moderate at the end. So now let's dig in. We've got a few learning objectives today that you can see here on the screen. I'm not going to read them because I want to get straight to the point. I want to jump in now and introduce our wonderful speakers for today. So Molly Van Loo, my colleague here, is the Vice President of Nutrition and Health at the International Fresh Produce Association, where she leads nutrition, public health engagement across policy, research, and industry initiatives. Annette Maggi is a registered dietitian and retail nutrition expert who works closely with us here at the Foundation and food retailers to advance nutrition education, shopper engagement at the point of sale. Emily Holdorf is a registered dietitian and the community and influencer manager here at the Foundation for Fresh Produce, and focuses on translating nutrition science into engaging, consumer-facing resources and educational materials. Stephanie Hodges is a public health nutrition consultant who partners with organizations to strengthen nutrition education, policy, and program implementation across community health settings. So before passing it over for the first presentation, our speaker disclosures are listed here on this slide. So I'm excited for this conversation today. I'm going to turn it over to Molly, who's going to cover an overview of the most recent dietary guidelines, what's changed, what's stayed the same, and share sentiments from both professionals and consumers. Molly, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. And thank you everyone for being here. I know I'm a new face to a lot of folks, and it's such a privilege to be talking with all of you who care so passionately about this topic and improving nutrition for Americans. So we know there's been so much conversation around the dietary guidelines, and you guys are credentialed and experts in this field. So we're hoping today to kind of provide things that you haven't heard in other places, and obviously focusing very specifically on fruits and vegetables. So some of this you may know already, but we just kind of want to level set on the fruit and vegetable components of the dietary guidelines before we get into some of the other conversations. So let's start. Um, so what hasn't changed? So despite all of the conversation, when you really get down to it, their fruits and vegetables are still kind of foundational in the dietary guidelines, right? There's the image, which we will talk about in a second, that gets a lot of the attention, and rightfully so, because that is the consumer facing piece. And then there are the actual guidelines of which there's a lot to talk about there too. But foundationally, fruits and vegetables are still an anchor in the dietary guidelines. We can keep going. Okay, so what has changed? So certainly the visual, right? The biggest one. And this, for all the reasons we don't have to talk about, has gotten a lot of the attention. One of the specifically challenging things I think around this is that the messaging of it was that we flipped the pyramid, right? But most of us on this call probably know that we've been living with My Plate for a long time. So the previous one was My Plate. And the taglines you can see there on the left, but the general idea for the fruit and vegetable recommendation was to make half your plate fruits and vegetables. Now, the new tagline is overall eat real food, and then eat vegetables and fruit throughout the day, both of which are valuable pieces to share with consumers, but we'll dig in deeper to what that actually means for dietitians a little bit later. So when we get more into the nitty gritty, the things that have changed, previous guidelines talked about cups. This set of guidelines talks around servings, and the rationale was that around that was that consumers had a challenging time understanding what a cup of a fruit or vegetable might be, which there's some truth in that, which I'm sure that people have experienced, especially across the different commodities. But we do kind of have this question now still of what is a serving, right? There's not necessarily awareness around what a serving is either. And then a big one, especially as we think about kind of public policy and public health, is the defined recommendations on the vegetable subgroup. So the last several dietary guidelines put vegetables into these 5 categories: red and orange, starchy, dark green leafy, other, and legumes. And then when you look at the current dietary guidelines, there's still definitely reference to eating a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, but they are no longer those 5 distinguishable subgroups. Just the order and how things are spoken about. Typically, you kind of sell fruits and vegetables, and now we're switching to vegetables and fruits. And that is a recognition that vegetables are more underconsumed, generally speaking, than fruit. Kind of a minor change, but just something that we've noticed. And then I think one of the bigger ones is like when you saw how the federal government and the dietary guidelines were referenced previously, you usually saw fruits and vegetables, whole grains, protein, and dairy. And now you're really seeing a shift from the top of talking about protein, dairy, vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. So, from our perspective, I think we got kind of bumped down. Even though the technical dietary guidelines have fruits and vegetables with that strong anchor still, the things that people are hearing about first tend to be protein and full fat dairy. And then forms specifically to fruits and vegetables. So the previous dietary guidelines had mostly whole, which includes pre-cut or those value-added pieces, fresh, canned, dried, with the different amounts for dry because of the density, and then frozen, and any of those forms without added sugar, salt, or fat. It did include 100% juice, but there were limits depending on ages. In the new dietary guidelines, they don't really reference it as fresh. They reference whole and raw, and then they call out canned, dried, frozen, and only without added sugar. So we've seen a removal of explicitly when we talk about fruits and vegetables of the no added salt and no added fat, even though, and we won't talk about sodium much today, but I'm sure you're all aware, right, that there's still the limit on I'm sorry, not sodium, on saturated fat, even though that doesn't necessarily kind of align up with that pyramid. And then there continues to be not as much specific about limiting or diluting 100% fruit juice or vegetable juice. And then the big one, ultra-processed foods, that wasn't mentioned previously explicitly. These new dietary guidelines call them highly processed foods and call for a limit of them. And in terms of kind of how we look at this from a federal policy, once there is, it sounds like a definition of ultra-processed foods is coming. So once that definition comes out, that could be a whole separate webinar, we'll have a better idea of what that looks like. Okay, so this is where it gets interesting. So perceptions of health professionals and consumers. So I don't want to misquote this, so I'm just going to look at my notes. I know that's not ideal, but in February we surveyed health professional community. Many of you, thank you, probably filled this out, and 70% indicated that they feel the new food pyramid graphic is unclear. About half of respondents felt that the guidance to eat fruits and vegetables throughout the day was neutral or somewhat unhelpful. But despite the confusion and the lack of clarity, 78% they were not likely to change their recommendations at all, or will continue with at similar levels. Now, there were then some that said they will recommend them even at higher levels. Respondents were most encouraged by the emphasis on whole foods, continuing to prioritize fruits and vegetables, and select nutrient emphasis areas like protein and added sugar reduction. There was widespread concern expressed regarding the confusion and poor usability with the new visuals, perceived overemphasis of red meat and saturated fat, and contradictions in the guidance in that area, and reduced clarity around fruits, vegetables, and specifically fiber, right? I waited too long to bring up fiber, but that's obviously a big one where we didn't see as much emphasis as we would have hoped when you look at the number of percentage of Americans under consuming fiber. So then let's switch to the consumer sentiment. And this chart is from our internal social listening platform. As you can see, consumers are largely concerned about the same topics and pieces of the guidelines as health professionals. In January, IFPA, our trade association, fielded a consumer pulse survey, which was 500 respondents. 34% of consumers report that at that time they were moderately or extremely aware of the new dietary guidelines. So that actually surprised me because I think that was higher than we ever kind of saw with My Plate, but that was at the peak, right, when it first came out. When asked, so of those that were familiar, when asked what actions they were likely to take because of the guidelines, 43% said they plan to buy more fruits and vegetables, the highest buy more across all food categories. So that was interesting because you would think, right, that that's a positive, and we obviously want to see people committing to that change, but we know in practice that that doesn't always happen, right? When you're asked, you're probably likely to answer sometimes aspirational more than reality. So, but it's still a really good anchor piece in understanding kind of how consumers are thinking. So what does all of this mean? And this is where we bring our professionals in. So it's very clear, right, that there are mixed reviews and thoughts on these latest dietary guidelines. But really what we want to anchor our conversation in today is the fact that barriers existed before these current dietary guidelines. Barriers still exist with the current dietary guidelines, and we're going to continue to have barriers. So how do we recognize this moment and still stay focused on addressing the barriers that exist for Americans and for consumers through the expertise of you all? So with that, I would love to bring the rest of our panel on and have a conversation in this space. So thank you. Katie introduced them earlier, so we want to make sure that we save most of our time for questions. So everyone up here, not me, is a dietitian. So you're all experts in this field, but you each have specialties in terms of the dietitians that you work with in your day to day. So kind of putting your hat on with those folks that you work with, how do you think these guidelines specifically will change the way the experts in each of your fields will be working with consumers or talking about dietary patterns with consumers? Annette, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure, Molly. And as mentioned in Katie's introduction, I do a lot of work with retail dietitians. And there's two things really that I'd like to point out here. I mean, one of them is that historical research by the Foundation for Fresh Produce has indicated that retail dietitians are like natural promoters of produce. And I know that will continue, that produce is part of kind of every conversation they're having, every recipe that they're promoting, every class that they're teaching. One of the most interesting things I've heard lately, Molly, is around, I think historically we've looked at the dietary guidelines for Americans as kind of this gold standard of eating habit recommendations for consumers. But now what I'm hearing from some retail dietitians is that they're looking at these most recent DGAs as one set of recommendations that are kind of equivalent to others from, say, the American Heart Association or other professional entities. And so I think they're shifting the focus a little bit. Well, for produce, I don't think that has much impact because the produce items, right, are positioned very well within even the current dietary guidelines. But it's an interesting kind of subtle change, I think, but definitely a change in how retail dietitians may be treating the guidelines in general.
Does that make consumer confusion navigating that even more confusing if it's viewed as another one versus kind of that gold standard?
Well, I think that's hard to know, right? Because while many influencers are very aware of the guidelines, not nearly as many consumers are aware of the guidelines in general. And so even if you look at the new pyramid, I mean, produce is still positioned well on there. So I don't think kind of broadly that impacts this particular category in general. I think retail will continue to see strong promotion of fruits and vegetables across the board, honestly.
Great. Let's move to Stephanie. So with a public health dietitian's perspective, what do you see here?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm working more at the population level and more specifically in federal policy. And I really see that behavior change is and can be shaped a lot more by systems and not necessarily just individual motivations or factors. So the new guidelines will absolutely influence how population level practitioners or program operators may think about meal patterns, menu standards, procurement, program design, and specifically across our federal nutrition assistance programs, as these really are required to align with federal dietary guidance. And when I think about big impact, I see that's really going to be in implementation, which we're kind of waiting to see what's going to happen there, because that's going to require that any updates to educational materials or program standards are implemented in ways that really minimize confusion for program participants. So the main focus is really helping program operators and other population level practitioners navigate these changes so they can continue to support evidence-based healthy eating patterns.
Yeah, very good. And Emily, from social influencer, social media kind of perspective, what are you anticipating with folks in that field?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't think there's going to be a major overhaul of change in terms of like the tactics. I think there's a lot of tried and true tactics, right, that we've used. I think it just honestly solidifies the importance of credentialed voices and being able to continue to elevate those voices. And I think through some of the conversation today, I think we'll kind of get in more into that and allude to how we can all kind of be on the same page and just continue to amplify those credentialed voices.
So like maybe let's go straight there. So what does putting the guidelines specifically for fruits and vegetables into practice kind of look like in each of your expert areas? Stephanie, do you want to kick this off for policy?
Yeah, sure. So, I talked a little bit about the federal programs, and so we talk about putting them into practice. I'll use schools as an example, and we actually have a really strong record to point to in terms of what the guidelines have done in terms of what is served at all of our child nutrition programs. They've really been the backbone of some of the most meaningful improvements in school meals over the past decade or two. We know the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act translated them into higher standards for fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. And we saw real shifts in what kids were being served every day. And now schools have implemented the 2024 final rule that we saw, and we saw another really important evolution from that. And those were added sugar limits for the first time. And that's really a big deal in improving health and nutrition. So these changes mean that menu planners are reviewing products, manufacturers may be reformulating, and districts are adjusting recipes to meet the new requirements. So in a really busy school setting, putting the guidelines into practice looks like procurement decisions that might be different, recipe revisions, staff training, and then ultimately, how do we communicate this to students and families as well?
Okay. And maybe we could talk a little bit about the vegetable subgroup piece that referenced earlier and how that has impacted school meals over the last decade or so.
Yeah, so early in the 2000s, the vegetable subgroups were developed. So the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee looked at the evidence and saw that to really meet the nutritional needs of this population, so children in K through 12, they really needed specific vegetables. And so this is where we got the vegetable subgroups. So dark green, red, orange, starchy, all of those things. And that's really what schools are operating around right now. We did see in the new dietary guidelines in the serving size chart that there's just a blanket vegetable. So we're not really sure yet what that means for operators. Does that mean that a school nutrition director could put the same vegetable on a school lunch tray 5 days a week? Maybe. So we're really looking to see that guidance in the form of a proposed rule and a final rule, but that definitely is very different than what we're seeing now in terms of just the variety of vegetables that are being served to make sure that they're meeting the nutritional needs.
Yeah, and we know in other nutrition programs too, those subgroups even impact kind of how calculations are made in SNAP or WIC because they take kind of the average prices to meet the dietary guidelines. So they're pulling from a wide variety of vegetables. Now, obviously, at the end of the day, the consumer can go in and buy what they want. It's not that specific as it is in school meals, but I think we'll be closely monitoring. And especially in school meals with the emphasis on protein, if the new, and I don't want to speculate, but if the updated nutrition standards perhaps call for more protein, which tends to, we think of fruits and vegetables as expensive, but protein is more expensive, like what will that do to the rest of the plate? Emily, or yes, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think it's a good point, Molly, because I think there's a lot of question, right, about what is the new meat recommendation and how does it translate? And I think I think we have to consider it of if suddenly consumers, embrace that recommendation of what does it mean for fruit and vegetable consumption of just because everybody is managing a budget right now, right? But from my perspective and what I know happens at retail, one of the things we've been seeing as really successful is the concept of pairing that, you pair fruits and vegetables with with meat or with non animal sources of protein or with dairy. And good thing is there are so many choices in fruits and vegetables that there's lots of options to pair. And so hopefully, and I know retailers really use that strategy because it leverages multiple departments of the grocery store. And it's a great strategy really to kind of create formula-based recipes that are easy, and just really focus on how you combine those different components and hopefully carry produce along, right? Whenever those meals are being made that focus more on protein potentially.
Yeah. Well, when you look at the pyramid, I would think what stuck out to me was like what I believe is a ribeye at the top, right? And like the dollar signs just start going off when you see that. But do you think like this is for anyone, like consumers perceive that to just reference protein or meat in general, or is it that specific to the cut of meat? And I mean, maybe in produce, when I look at fruits and vegetables, I don't necessarily see like you must eat the exact ones that are on the pyramid, but like what do you think the consumer perception is when they're seeing those different types of meat?
I feel like that choice was intentional to give permission in some regard to higher items. I mean, I think collectively that the concern I hear most from other health professionals is around this idea that protein requirement is jumping fairly significantly, but saturated fat is staying the same. And it's extraordinarily difficult to make those both align within healthy dietary patterns. So, but I think we're definitely seeing, Molly, a focus on, multiple types of fat as part of the whole foods messaging.
Yeah, yeah. I guess to piggyback on that, what have you been hearing from your peers in terms of, I think for many people, especially people who may, need to work on improving healthier dietary patterns, something with high saturated fat probably will appeal better, right? Like from a flavor profile, if we're just being super realistic, right? So are there any concerns that a consumer will kind of pick from the pyramid like piecemeal, like what works best for them versus that kind of overall eating pattern? And I know you referenced, the role for pairings, but are there any concerns that it'll just be kind of like pick a few?
I know. Oh, go ahead, Em.
I can jump in for this because this is something that I was thinking about and before when I was preparing for the webinar here is like this eating pattern concept. And I think that as health professionals, we're trained to look at the whole picture of the whole day, the whole plate, all of it. I don't know that consumers are necessarily thinking about their whole day from this like bird's eye view. I think they tend to, I think even just as a person, I tend to think in like, all right, what am I having for dinner? What do I need to bring with me on this trip that I'm going on? Like these singular decisions. Even though, I personally have that training of being able to look at the whole eating pattern. I think that's why, honestly, like the protein focus has been so big and continues to be. So I think that's where we have to kind of get creative in how we're educating, what the messages we're saying to consumers are, and really lean hard into that actionable piece versus this whole like theory of, oh, like you can have some of these higher fat items, in combination with all the other things. So like my classic example that I love to go to is like, okay, I'm already eating cereal. Can I add a fruit to this? Like, can I add something to what I'm already doing, and just making it actionable in that way versus this like theoretical dietary pattern for your whole day or month or year.
To kind of piggyback on that, like I know some of the retail dietitians have done work because they get questions from their leadership and C-suite because those people don't have a health background at all, but they've been trying to showcase like if you really actually included whole milk, butter, higher fat meats in dietary patterns and in a day, how quickly you get to saturated fat. So I think there's a piece about making it real for people and showcasing what does this really look like? Because you pretty quickly get to 10% of calories from saturated fat by making those changes. And so I think it's a great strategy to kind of visually show consumers so that they understand this isn't just go for it. You know, you still have to manage against that saturated fat recommendation.
Interesting. We haven't talked about fiber too much, but I know that that's come up a lot in conversations, be it in DC or outside of, because there's so much emphasis on protein. We know fiber is underconsumed, and folks would have seen a little bit more or a lot, probably more focus on fiber. So what do you think? And it kind of is, I mean, clearly protein's trendy, right? And it's worked. People are absolutely striving to reach protein. So how can we use these dietary guidelines to maybe focus on fiber? What are some barriers that you're seeing in the fiber space?
Yeah, I can maybe speak to the fiber piece, especially in terms of our federal programs. And, fiber was mentioned in the new guidelines, not as much as it was mentioned in prior editions of the guidelines. And we still have about 95% of people who aren't meeting fiber recommendations. So, when you do put such a huge emphasis on one food group like protein and specifically animal-based proteins, how do you make sure that people aren't forgetting these other really important nutrients? And how do we make sure that they know where these nutrients come from, right? I believe there was some survey data that was showing that people thought fiber came from animal-based proteins, and that's not correct, right? So it goes a little bit beyond just telling people you need more protein, you need more fiber. How do we make sure that they know where to get those nutrients from and where to get those food groups from? And I think too, if we're encouraging, especially a school example, if there are requirements to increase a meat or meat alternate, that takes a lot of funding for school nutrition directors, and they're going to unfortunately have to find some way to balance their reimbursement. And so is that going to be taking away some fiber rich options like a huge variety of fruits and vegetables, a bigger variety of grains? And so what does that mean in terms of the complete plate of where does fiber fall and where do these fiber rich foods fall? Are they just in smaller amounts, or are they totally going away? So it is a concern of when we put one nutrient kind of over the others, how do we make sure that people aren't going to become even more nutrient deficient by just focusing on one tagline or, one specific food group?
Yeah. There's some good questions coming in. So along this line, so do you feel people are loading up on meat? Or protein, I guess, and then are becoming too full for other food groups? So this was kind of related to the fiber question that came in. Do we have any evidence of that people consuming more meat are under consuming other foods of high nutrient value?
Well, I mean, I would say that they're choosing to avoid other food groups potentially. So, I mean, you still see keto out there, you still see low carb diets out there. I mean, I think, Molly, it's an interesting point about the overall positioning of carbohydrate foods or high carbohydrate foods of definitely been positioned lower. And I mean, I don't know exactly the research, but I know there's research to show that it's very difficult to get the fiber you need just from fruits and vegetables, that you need grain foods in order to get all of the fiber you need. And Stephanie, I know there's some work being done, and a lot of school food service operators will say that kids they won't take or they won't eat like whole grain rolls or even whole wheat pasta, and they notice the color difference and all of those things. So it's really about finding that balance, but it's like, as we see carbohydrate foods falling off of that pyramid and in a much lower position, I think it's concerning from an overall nutrient composition of eating habits for sure.
Anything else to add there from others?
Maybe just on the school piece, when we look at a lot of really popular breakfasts. One is a yogurt parfait, right? And so it might contain yogurt, it might contain fruit, and it might contain granola. And if we see pretty drastic changes to any sort of grain requirement in the school meal patterns, like what does that end up doing? So I think we can't look at these things just in a silo. We can't look at each individual food group as just fruit, just vegetable, just protein, just grain, just dairy. I think we have to look at the complete picture of, any of these changes are going to impact the other food group. Even, though we have a really big emphasis on fruits and vegetables in the new guidelines, there potentially is still going to be an impact of how those items are served with other foods, but then also looking at the price point issue with having to incorporate potentially more animal-based protein. So it's a little bit complex in knowing exactly what's going to happen, but ultimately I think everything is going to be impacted or shift at least in some way.
Very good. So an issue, I think, for all consumers, but it's an issue inside DC too, with policy, is this area of affordability and food affordability, which I think is really a bigger conversation of many things that are expensive, and obviously people have to eat. But fruits and vegetables remain a barrier that people cite for fruits and vegetables remains affordability. So I'm interested, and we talk about this a lot, because when you kind of look at pricing in the grocery store, outside of some of those, higher priced commodities that people often cite, there are a lot of, if you're just looking at the price, affordable fruits and vegetables. So the conversation around affordability is, I think, a little bit more nuanced than just what does this specific item cost, right? So, but that doesn't change the fact that it is still the number one thing most people will cite for a barrier, particularly lower income people. So how, in each of your expert areas, are you thinking, navigating this idea of affordability as it relates to produce?
I can jump in, Molly, on this. One of the things that's interesting, and you're familiar, and I think probably many people on the webinar today are familiar with produce prescription programs, which ultimately are in many states and through many programs implemented at grocery retail. And I hear from a lot of retail RDs that one of the challenges they have with those programs is consumers are not using the full benefit of those cards, which I think is surprising, because when it gets to affordability, right, you think about, well, if you're being given this money to specifically buy produce, you would max that out. I think it gets to the point that, yes, affordability matters, but there are also things like, with berries, for example, they're highly perishable and they might only last a couple days. But also, families aren't necessarily willing to try fruits or vegetables that maybe their family isn't as familiar with. But I think we have to think about all these other kind of barriers to that produce consumption. And, Emily, you brought up a great example of where habit forming is so important. So when you have cereal, you have fruit. And that's a really easy way to make sure you're getting in that extra serving of fruit. But so I think in addition to affordability, there's things like habit forming and some other kind of behavioral techniques that really can help consumers to make sure they're getting the adequate servings of fruits and vegetables every day.
Yeah, and I know I've already talked a little bit about how increased cost could impact fruits and vegetables in terms of school meals. And, I think one of the best examples of this is we saw in the WIC program that when there was the higher cash value benefit, people bought more varieties of fruits and vegetables. They were willing to buy fruits and vegetables that their kids had maybe never had because they had a little bit of the extra benefit to try out some new things. They were able to buy higher cost fruits and vegetables, berries, for example. And so we know that being able to have those additional dollars, those additional benefits can really help in terms of making sure people can adhere to the dietary guidelines and the recommended amounts, but also to kind of experiment a little bit and get some different variety and flavors in there. So that's just kind of one thing to think about. And program operators are going to be really creative in terms of what they're able to do with their reimbursement dollars, whether this is a daycare center, whether this is a school nutrition director, whether this is someone operating a senior nutrition program. And so they're going to get really creative, but knowing that if we did have additional dollars to be able to really support these recommendations in terms of reimbursement would probably be the best avenue to go.
Great. Emily?
Yeah, and I just saw here in the chat someone had put that some people just simply don't know how to use or cook or prepare fruits and veggies, and that was honestly going to be my point. Of I think cost is oftentimes tied to confidence and not just like the actual literal price. So how can foods like stretch across meals and portions and different use cases? And so that major barrier is the perceived risk aspect. So the fear of food waste, uncertainty about how you make something or prepare it, or maybe you're worried that if you do prepare it, it's not going to get eaten. So I think even when the confidence is low, I think that even affordable options can feel expensive, and that oftentimes probably is the case specific to fruits and veggies. So I think that's where focusing on like the flexibility aspects, encouraging like simple swaps, or like if you like avocado toast, like here, try it on, a slice of sweet potato that's been roasted, or like just similar use cases and applications that can pique people's interests. And I think coming back to just really like focusing on what the practical application piece, kind of how I was saying before, of like, how do I make this actionable, of like, this is something I could do today. It doesn't need to be this in an ideal world. I can buy all these fruits and veggies and cut them up and prepare them from scratch and do all the things. Like really being simplified and showing that flexibility piece of, okay, if I bought this convenience item, can I add a fruit or veggie to it? And that's the meal and we're done. So like focusing less on really intense cooking methods and recipes and things like that, and maybe just more on this like formulaic kind of, here, pair this with that and this, and then you're done kind of thing.
Keep it simple. Yeah, great. Well, thank you. And we have a lot of great questions. I went rogue earlier. I got too excited looking at the questions, but we're gonna bring Katie back in to formally ask them. So thank you for all the questions. Keep them coming.
There's a lot. I've been trying to kind of lump some things together. Just taking us one step back, I thought this was interesting. And it's the positioning of who the dietary guidelines are written for. So I thought we could address that one. And the question was about, are we going to see a shift that it's more that they might start to be written for a consumer versus what they were originally intended to inform federal policy? So anyone want to start with that one? That's almost like maybe we should have led with that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, historically, the dietary guidelines were written to inform federal programs, right? So it's to inform school meals, it's to inform the WIC food package, it's to inform the Thrifty Food Plan, which is what SNAP benefits are based on. So historically, it really has had that underlying, basis of it's here to support federal programs. That doesn't mean that a general consumer couldn't look up the dietary guidelines and say, what should I be eating? Or if they Google, what should I be eating, that the dietary guidelines don't come back as a result. I think what's different this time is that they really took a lot of effort to put these in a consumer-facing way. That takes additional funding, that takes additional staff time, and prior, that wasn't necessarily the goal, right? And so I do think the prioritization of consumer-facing versus informing programs is different this edition, and that's why we're seeing so many consumers be interested in what they say. That's why we're seeing news articles about protein. That's why we're seeing a lot of these things that we are. However, it's not to say that In the past, that wasn't something that the departments wanted. They wanted consumers to pick these up. They wanted consumers to be able to know what to eat and how to eat it and how often. It's just not necessarily was their kind of objective in what they were doing in terms of the guidelines. The objective was really to publish the guidelines, and they did that. And if there's no additional funding to do a massive communications campaign or massive consumer outreach, then that's kind of where it stops. So I think that is different this time, and that's why we're seeing so many consumers engaged in this conversation.
I think the other interesting thing, and Molly, you brought up in the overview that for the first time we're seeing highly processed foods mentioned in the DGAs. And I think that's something that's interesting because I think the guidelines are kind of predicated on this idea of nobody eats any highly processed foods. And so all these other rules are allowed. And I think there's significant challenge to Stephanie's point in how does that translate to the consumer, right? IFIC, the International Food Information Council, had done some social listening work related to ultra processed foods. And it's interesting because what you find is you see a lot of the parent in the snack aisle they're not trading from a highly processed snack to fruits and vegetables, which is what we want them to do, right? But they're trading from a highly processed snack to a snack with a cleaner ingredient deck. And that isn't really the point, when we think about what are healthy dietary patterns. And so I think to Stephanie's point of absent funding to really educate about the different components and what it really means, I don't know that we'll see significant consumer change really.
I don't know that there's really an answer, but I think we have to acknowledge that, more than ever, there's the social media landscape for these dietary guidelines, especially with the Make America Healthy Again movement, which had really came in because of their ability to influence individuals in social media. So this is a champ. So it was targeted, right, for it to become a consumer facing piece. So I think it's interesting, we don't know yet how it will impact consumer behavior. All the barriers we have for fruits and vegetables are barriers no matter what, right? I think it'll be interesting to see how this influences the next dietary guidelines too, and how the government approaches it.
Mm-hmm. To build, someone asked, how are they translated into everyday decisions? And I think that's what we're all trying to figure out, right? That it's up to us as communicators, as an influencer, wherever you are, whether you're counseling patients one-on-one or you're a retail dietitian or you're wherever you are, if you can make an impact, that's what all of us are trying to do to translate into the shopping, the cooking, and the feeding, and the actual eating of all the good foods, and in particular fruits and vegetables, right? Anybody want to build on that? And then there's a question about my plate being replaced. I mean,
yeah, my plate was replaced, with the pyramid. Yeah, officially. Yeah. I mean, you'll still see references to it. It's still in schools. It took a long time for the original pyramid. I even see that floating around sometimes. But yes, officially my plate was replaced by the current pyramid.
Just really quick too, when we're thinking about like what does it mean for consumers? Like my plate was intended to be like that consumer facing part of the dietary guidelines. So I think now it's just taking a little bit of a shift. And you guys all already answered it, but it's not new to have an arm of the guidelines with a communications plan for consumers, right? That's what my plate was, and a lot was invested in that, which I think we'll get past. Yeah, it's still a good guide.
I mean, to your point though, like the American Diabetes Association has a program that built off of the plate called the Diabetes Plate. So it's to help people with diabetes or pre-diabetes kind of manage against what should half your plate of non-starchy veg look like? What's 1/4 your plate of protein? And so, I mean, I agree, Molly, that we saw shifts and it takes time, but there are other programs that have built on the concept of the plate that are still relevant. And I assume that those will all still continue because they're not directly attached to the DGAs.
And that was another question that came up that I wanted to bring up because it's a good one. And that was what new guidance is needed for patients with chronic disease where diet plays a key factor in managing. And, I think there's a lot of talk recently about like preventative versus management, and even in as a produce prescription platform. Does anybody want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dietary guidelines are kind of intended for a broad consumer audience, right? It's not specific to someone with diabetes. It's not specific to someone with heart disease. And so I think this is really where we rely on our dietitians and other health and wellness practitioners to be able to tailor that guidance, right? And so they know best. They're working individually with these patients and clients every day. So they might use the dietary guidelines or other evidence-based dietary patterns as kind of a platform, but really individualizing and tailoring is really what that's about. And the guidelines did talk a little bit about chronic disease, but they're really not geared specifically for specific chronic diseases. It really is supposed to be an overarching healthy eating pattern. And so if someone has a chronic disease, especially that's impacted by nutrition, it really is best for them to get that guidance and information from a dietitian or their healthcare provider or practitioner.
Yep. Thank you. We are kind of running out of time. I don't know if you guys can see the Q&A, if there's anything else. There's a lot of questions about protein, but I think we talked about a lot of that. Steph, you talked a lot about, I think the biggest impact could be in schools. One question that was good was, will we continue to talk about the subgroups in materials? And you want to address that? I think that's a good question of like, will we still talk about subgroups in our stuff, even if it's not in the guidelines, and how does that make an impact?
Well, I'll let you all speak to the specific material part, but what I will say is just because the vegetable subgroups were removed in the serving size chart doesn't remove all of the evidence that we have about the importance of specific types of vegetables. So while that serving size chart may have been done to be easier and to, make things a little bit more across the board, it doesn't undo the evidence that we have about why it's so important to consume these different vegetable subgroups. And so, we may see school nutrition directors, if they get rid of vegetable subgroups, stick with what they already have on their menu planning, right? They already know that the kids really like these different types of vegetables. They already know how to put them into their meal plans. They already know how they fit into the meal pattern. So we might continue to see that. But in terms of materials, I'll let you all take that one.
Yep. Do you want to lean in on that? I'm seeing a lot of convos in the chat of just like, it feels like schools need a lot of nutrition education support. So we'll probably be listening for that, but other places where we might be listening and looking and getting that feedback of like, where does everybody need us to help through our materials?
One thing I'll mention too is that, I would say that USDA and HHS have both been clear that schools will go first as far as changing guidelines to comply with the DGAs. But it's also clear that WIC will be impacted at some level, that military will be impacted too, potentially. It's just a matter of timing. But my sense and everything I hear from policy friends, and Molly and Stephanie, you guys work in those spaces as well, but that the goal is really to kind of drive against really funded programs with the new guidelines and the new recommendations. And so I think, to Stephanie's point, that health professionals really will focus on the individual and what's their health history, what conditions are they managing, and things like that. But we will see eventually proposed rules or proposed implementation in federal feeding programs beyond schools as well.
Yeah, and just a little bit more insight into that too is that's a super long process. So, for instance, we saw a proposed rule for the WIC food package changes, I believe in 2022. We had a final rule in 2024. The implementation is just now finishing in April 2026, right? So, even if we see a proposed rule later this year, there's going to be a really long process to actually getting to that implementation. So, I don't want anyone to panic and think, oh my gosh, there's going to be all these changes to school meals right away. That's typically not how that's done. That's typically not the process. But we do expect that. And luckily for WIC, there's a lot of flexibility for participants to be able to use their fruit and vegetable benefit kind of how they want, as long as they're eligible fruits and vegetables. So hopefully we won't see, really any substantial changes there that would shift dollars away from fruits and vegetables. But definitely for school meals, senior nutrition programs, our federal food service guidelines, things like that. But know that it's probably not going to be as immediate as it might seem. It's really a years long process.
Mhm. Mhm.
And Stephanie, isn't it true also that the last round of school lunch guidelines haven't even fully been implemented, right? Some of those are 27, 28 school year. So I think there's this concern of how does this all play out, you
Yeah,
know?
even longer. I mean, we see the added sugars limits. They started out with product-based limits. That eventually changes. Sodium target limits, I think, go all the way to 2031. I mean, these are really long phased in approaches because products are manufactured and formulated one way. And if there have to be changes to that, that takes time for manufacturers to do. It takes investment, it takes time. So, yeah, it's definitely a long game when it comes to a lot of these programs because they impact so many people.
What a great conversation. We are about 4 minutes out. Anybody have final thoughts? Who wants to have the final word? Molly, do you want to bring us home
Oh,
at
geez,
the
no
end of the
pressure. I mean,
day?
I'll start from, and I think we use it as an up. I mean, the great thing I think is that I can't think of a time when more people were talking about health and nutrition, which creates a platform for evidence-based, credentialed individuals to enter the picture and provide that advice. So I say stay focused on the barriers that we've always known to be true, find the opportunities where they exist, and yeah, I think we'll be able to chip away at this. So thanks everyone for joining.
Very good. Do you want to bring up the slides and I'll bring us home?
Sure
Appreciate
thing.
you all. What a wonderful talk. So with that, I do want to let you know about a new resource. This is a comprehensive guide that is all things fruit and veggies. It even has global dietary guidance from around the world to kind of help you paint the picture. All the information about the non-communicable diseases, and then just everything you need to know about how to talk to consumers about fruits and vegetables, whether you're in schools, in retail, or in a private practice. If you take away nothing else, we want you to remember fruitsandveggies.org is your one-stop shop for all things fruits and veg. Everything from how to select, store, save, or serve, recipe inspiration, blogs, curated content, everything you need to know. Maybe even some of the resources that you all are looking for could be found in that for professionals section today. So, with that, I thank you all for spending your day with us this afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are in the world. And I hope you have a happy and healthy spring and see many occasions to have a plant. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of our panelists today. Appreciate y'all.